For this presentation, I'm going to discuss the points from my argumentative paper on school violence. The title of the paper is School Violence Persists, Uncovering the Truth. By way of introduction, just within the first couple of months of 2018, there were 18 gun-related injuries and deaths that took place in schools. Threats in the weeks following the shooting that took place on Valentine's Day at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, threats that were typically around 10 per day increased to about 50 per day. Between February of 1996 and October of 2014, there were 62 school-related shootings that made headlines. Between 1997 and 2012, a total of 10 teenage boys killed 73 students, parents, and teachers, and wounded 99 others. There's been tons of discussion and controversy that has been sparked since these major headlines over items such as gun control and mental health, which are major issues. Schools have responded in big ways. They've offered many different strategies, but still the problem remains. Before we get into the different strategies that school districts have implemented thus far and the problems with those strategies, we're going to do some background and go over the history of school violence. Way back in the day, when school violence was first noticed, the focus at that time was primarily on youth, just in general, the antisocial behaviors that youth tended to exhibit. Interest in this topic was primarily from public health officials and different researchers who were interested in the reasons behind this antisocial behavior. Schools were simply a place where there were lots of youth present, so it became a natural place for research to be conducted. In the 1980s, there was a huge increase in youth homicide, primarily gunshot wounds that physicians began noticing in hospitals. So physicians, psychologists, and psychiatrists began researching more prominently and searching for treatment and prevention methods of these homicides. And the implementation of their research and the methods that they determined that might be effective were put into place, and that happened in schools. Educators at this point in time really weren't part of the conversation. They kind of felt like they had enough to do and viewed their role in this problem of school violence just within the framework of disciplining students. Some background. As far as a definition, school violence lacks a really clear definition. Some of that is because of the history being as varied as it was. For this paper, however, and for the purposes of a common definition, we're going to say that school violence refers to deliberate acts of aggression, including physical and verbal threats toward another person that takes place on school grounds and or during school functions. Interestingly, the profiles of those individuals who have committed the most well-known acts of violence that we have seen in schools are pretty similar. They've been white males from middle-class families. Most of them had no real history of violence in their past. Many of them were honor roll students, and all but just about one committed suicide in the end. And they ranged in age from age 11 to 18. There were tons of planning, lots of planning that went into these events for many of them, and most of them shared information of some sort about their plans, or information that alluded to their plans with others, friends, people who they interacted with, or in some type of an online forum. Additionally, the things that we don't hear so much about because it's not sensationalized by the media are the tons of other situations and students who have been arrested because they had plans to commit mass murders within their schools. Those stories don't seem to get nearly as much attention, but they are out there. So although schools have attempted to prevent violence from occurring through the use of several different strategies that we're going to discuss, none of them have been overly successful. So to begin, the first strategy that schools implemented, and many still use unfortunately, are zero tolerance policies or other policies that are exclusionary in nature. And their intent was to harshly punish any student who violated the discipline policy. No ifs, ands, or buts. Advocates of this type of a policy claim that the policies are effective because they eliminate threats of violence and that they allow students who follow the rules to maintain their focus on education in a safe environment. The problem with this, however, is that common sense is removed from the equation. Individual circumstances surrounding each of these disciplinary incidents, they're not even considered. These policies also fail to account for things that may be developmentally appropriate misbehaviors and judgment calls. For instance, let's keep in mind that these policies are applicable to students who are as young as 5 years old in kindergarten, all the way up to seniors who are 17 and 18 years old. And the same policy is the same policy if a district has adopted it. So it doesn't allow for developmentally appropriate behaviors to be taken into consideration. Further, Randy Weingarten, who's the president of the American Federation of Teachers, was formerly a major supporter of these types of policies. And even she came out in the year 2016 and said that the zero tolerance policies have failed, and they don't promote the warm and inviting atmospheres that schools should be promoting. They also don't foster strong connections with students. Instead, exclusionary policies create a division between students and families in the school community. For example, Nicholas Cruz, who was the former student at Marjory Stoneman Douglas, who shot and killed 17 people on Valentine's Day, was formerly subjected to an exclusionary disciplinary policy prior to committing his act of violence. And obviously, that policy did not prevent him from going on to murder 17 people. The second strategy that we see schools implement, and many schools, most schools I would say, have at least one of these, if not more, is the use of surveillance equipment, metal detectors, security cameras, and police officers. And of course, the intent is good. They want to prevent weapons from making it into a school building, or to discover any weapons that might make it in before they can be used for harm. They also hope to deter violent acts from taking place, or if there is a violent act that takes place, to be able to quickly intervene and prevent further damage. These strategies have effectively decreased the number of weapons that have been brought into schools, but there have been some consequences of those policies, of these strategies. For example, implementation of these sorts of prevention measures has increased students' uneasiness and fear. It doesn't address the underlying issue that students are bringing weapons to school. Why are they bringing them to school in the first place? And this is a question that definitely deserves some exploration. Cost to the districts to employ officers and equipment is fairly substantial, and it doesn't promote a welcoming environment. Rather, schools are beginning to feel more like prisons to students instead of welcoming places to be. Some studies have found that the presence of measures such as security measures, surveillance, cameras, metal detectors, officers, can actually result in increased disorder and chaos within a school building. And finally, students who might be subjected to searches can feel a sense of humiliation, distrust toward the adults who are in the school building, and resentment toward them as well, none of which foster positive interactions in schools. The third strategy that we're going to discuss would be instructional-based programs. There are so many that we can't even begin to name them all, but a few examples would include the Olveus anti-bullying program, Schweb's, which is the school-wide positive behavior system, and any number of character education programs, too many to mention. But the intent here, again, is quite positive. The goal is to target behaviors that predict violence in an attempt to make students more socially aware. And the hope is that if students are made more socially aware, then they might help to curb violence among youth. And this kind of was born back in 1994. There was the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. We know that act today as the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And back then, they mandated that if a district received federal funds, they must implement violence prevention programming. And further, they were also required to produce data on outcomes of these programs. Several different issues with this type of a strategy. The first being time. In order to implement any particular program with fidelity, time is required. There have to be multiple lessons, and they have to be taught consistently if we want these programs to be effective. Research does support school-wide approaches, but many of the available programs target certain age ranges, or they provide more resources for one particular end of the spectrum than another. So that indicates a need for much more integrated approaches to this sort of programming. There tend to be more elementary programs available than programs on the secondary level for obvious reasons. The data out there on the effectiveness of these instructional-based programs is limited. There is one long-term study that found that programs that include only problem students tend to be counter-effective. They tend to reinforce negative behavior patterns rather than reinforcing positive or offering positive behavior solutions. Other studies have found that many of the programs, specifically Olveus included, focused on reducing undesirable behavior rather than constructing positive behavior. And when you do that, it really limits the power and the breadth of the program. So there are several different issues with these programs. Not that they can't be effective, but there are some challenges in order to make them and help them to be as effective as possible. The next strategy we're going to talk about is the profiling of students. In other words, trying to identify early warning signs of at-risk behaviors that students might exhibit. And when we do this in schools, we tend to look at the discipline history. And the reason we do that is because we believe that past behavior traditionally predicts future behavior. And counseling tends to be offered for students who are identified as being at risk or who are predicted to potentially commit acts of violence. The problem with profiling students in this way is that it results in a label, and oftentimes it's an inaccurate label. And these labels, inaccurate or otherwise, lead to isolation, and they tend to limit opportunities for students moving forward. The reality is that there are many, many students in our schools today who exhibit some of our indicated early warning signs, but who will never go on to commit any act of violence. And just the opposite of that is true as well. Many of the students may never exhibit any of these warning signs that we look for, and they may be the ones who do go on to commit violent acts. Research shows us that there are many, many additional factors besides discipline records that play a part in the developmental process of our students, making this strategy pretty ineffective. Case in point, all but one of our young men that we've discussed so far went on to take their own lives, and each had some sort of either suspected or diagnosed mental health issues, but none were suspected, those who did receive mental health services, none of them were suspected of being capable of committing such heinous acts. The next strategy we'll discuss is mediation, and there's several different forms of mediation. There can be adult-based mediation or peer-led mediation, and school-based counseling opportunities. The intent of these strategies is to help and provide support to students based on their discipline history or to intervene during or after a specific disciplinary incident. These approaches, however, tend to be reactive as opposed to being proactive. There are so many different people with different backgrounds working with students, depending on the resources districts have available to them and the training available within those districts, which leaves very little control over whether the program or the strategy is successful or is a failure. The U.S. Surgeon General reports that there are several violence prevention strategies that are ineffective and potentially harmful. And within that report, he actually includes peer-led counseling programs and peer mediation as examples. Within the paper, I actually discuss and tell a little story about a boy named Kevin. And this story is told from the perspective of a mental health counselor who worked with Kevin and his mother. And basically the story goes like this. Mom brings Kevin in to see the counselor because Kevin is misbehaving, not listening at home. Mom cannot control him and cannot get him to listen to her for anything. He is self-mutilating. Kevin has a brother who's in jail, and Kevin's very proud of this fact. He exhibits quite a bit of rage to the point that the counselor is almost somewhat fearful of this child. When the counselor was able to have Kevin and his mother sit down in the same room for counseling, he was able to kind of control and verbalize his rage in better ways. So some time goes by and Kevin starts to show some signs of improvement. He begins playing the guitar, finds a girlfriend who he's spending time with, But then we reach a point where Kevin and the girlfriend would like to be alone in his bedroom together, and mom puts her foot down and says no. And at this point, Kevin becomes desperate in his self-mutilation and finally distances himself from the relationship and ceases going to counseling altogether. So as much as this was a reactive approach to issues that we're having at home, mom was having at home, we need to be looking at some other proactive ways of helping students before we get to these desperate places. The last strategy we're going to talk about today is that of arming teachers and staff members within schools. This is a pretty controversial topic right now as well. And the intent, again, is very good and well-intentioned, especially for rural districts. The response time, if there were to be an emergency or a school shooting or a major act of violence, the response time that it takes for law enforcement or emergency personnel to show up to the school to provide that help is inhibitive to student safety. And this is an issue within my own district that I see, and one of the reasons that we do have a school security officer who is armed. Some also believe that the presence of guns in schools by armed teachers or officers actually decreases the likelihood of a shooter entering the building. They think that if the shooter knows that there are people within that building who are armed and ready to fight back, that they are less likely to target that particular building. However, there are many, many counter arguments against arming teachers in school buildings, and the first being that teachers already have a full plate of responsibilities that's challenging enough, and many of the things teachers are faced with today already go above and beyond that of educators. So adding one more thing, such as this concern of carrying a weapon and making sure that it's safe at all times, is a huge undertaking and another additional responsibility that could lead to teacher burnout. School climate is something we need to take into consideration. There's lots of research out there that says school climate is where we need to be looking when we're looking to prevent school violence. And having more guns in school buildings, does that negatively affect school climate or positively affect school climate? And there are arguments on both sides of that. Research shows that having increased gun access and possession are absolutely not linked to prevention of violence. And the cost association is huge. If we think about arming even a portion of America's teachers, there are 3.1 million teachers approximately in the United States. Even arming a portion of that number is astronomical. Liability insurance is a huge issue as well. Kansas school districts found that out when they made the decision to permit teachers to bring concealed weapons to school. And shortly after making that decision, they were notified by their insurance carrier that they would no longer be covered if they made this decision. And other districts have run into similar roadblocks when making decisions like this. And lastly, some researchers cite the need for more empathy and fewer guns in school buildings, which references school climate once again. So in summary, school violence is very clearly still a problem today. There are many different forms of violence occurring in schools, and many of the strategies that we discussed are ineffective, even though they've been implemented with good intentions, and there are some levels of effectiveness in some of those strategies. Overall, they are not curbing school violence. So finally, what I want you to take away from this is that the concept of school violence is not new. In fact, if we really look at statistics, school violence that's actually resulted in death has declined over the years. So although school violence is still prominent and is still happening, and it appears because of sensationalizing it, it appears as though it is increasing. Violence that has resulted in death in schools has declined. But if we really want to look at school shootings, they're not anything new. We have records of school shootings that date back all the way to 1927. And even earlier than that, back in 1874, there are newspaper articles showing concern over the fact that young boys carry handguns to school. And there's discussion surrounding the possibility of needing to search students for these guns. However, we need to keep in mind that although school violence is not new, It's a little different in today's day and age. So today's violence and cries for help, in addition to the shootings that are taking place, are widely publicized, and they come in many, many different forms. There's bullying, fights, gangs, and threats. All of these things need to be taken into consideration and investigated to kind of uncover and determine why this is happening. Attempts have been made by the schools, but none have proven overly effective in the prevention of school violence. So, for the children's sake and for the sake of our country and the well being of our students who are our future, it's crucial that we continue to seek more widely effective ways to support students and try to prevent school violence from occurring.